right, good morning, everybody. Today is Saturday, March 8th. It's 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for joining episode 4 of the Nutanix series in the Home Lab. And so today we're really going to focus on Nutanix Unified Storage. And we're going to talk about this. I'm going to walk through the background of Unified Storage, the implementation of it. I've already installed the components, right? The solutions that actually encompass the Unified Storage feature set. And I'll walk you through that a little bit, and then we'll get into the use cases. And I have a lot of things already set up and integrated, everything from file shares to integration with object services for things like Kubernetes and registry entries, and using files and NFS for Kubernetes as an example, using objects for backup. So we're going to get into all these different use cases that we see Nutanix Unified Storage being used for. I know I'm going to miss a bunch of other use cases, but the time I had this week to actually set this up, I probably did about 4 or 5 use cases that I see that are very common. And then, of course, we'll talk about what's backing all of this, right? So in episodes 1 through 3, you saw us grow into the platform service capabilities, and Nutanix Unified Storage are additional platform capabilities. Again, Nutanix is a software company, and we support applications, and not just applications running on our platform, but our services are applications, right? And so we're going to get into what that looks like a little bit more with Unified Storage. We're going to talk about files. We're going to talk about objects, and we're going to touch a little bit on governance. We do have a lot of capability around governance. We actually have 2 capabilities, one on-prem capability, which I'll focus on today, called Files Analytics, and another solution that's a SaaS offering, which is included with our Unified Storage offering, called Data Lens, which I won't be able to get into too much. Maybe we'll cover that in a later date. But Data Lens, think of it as your unstructured data governance capability, right, for your entire estate. But we'll show you a little bit of that capability in Files Analytics as a more on-prem focused governance capability. And then we'll get into, actually, like I said, I'll show you some demos. These demos are already set up, so I'm not going to show you basically how to configure those. You can go into the documentation and see a lot of that. But I will walk through how I got here, how I enabled the services, just like we did with self-service and the other things that we've done thus far. I'm going to build on some of the things that we've already done as well. Like we already implemented backup through Haiku, and I showed you integration with categories. But where is that backup storage targeting, right? Where am I targeting that storage? And there are use cases around that we see that are very common with Unified Storage. The beauty about Nutanix Unified Storage is that it's built on, for the most part, built on the foundational aspect of our distributed storage stack. Okay, so that's one part of it. There is another part of it where the value, of course, we believe is in the software side of it, the management, the implementation, the operations of it, and therefore you have the capability of running this files as an example service on native AWS backend versus having it running on Nutanix substrate as an example, right? So again, you're starting to see Nutanix really decouple some of these service capabilities from the underlying HCI and what we call an Acropolis operating system core foundation, and not having to require that to leverage our additional service capability. But we're going to focus on AOS support, foundational services when it comes to files and objects today, and we'll get right into it. So let's start with the demo. Again, before I start here, we do have chat up. I did post the link. Actually, let me post this link again really quick. So you can see the link here at the bottom. This is the YouTube channel. If you go to the YouTube live channel, you'll be able to actually interact with the chat. I'm only streaming to YouTube, my YouTube channel, and to LinkedIn. If you're watching on LinkedIn, you're only going to be able to view the chat, not actually interact with the chat. And I also noticed that the YouTube stream has a little bit better quality for some reason. I'm not sure, since I'm streaming in 1080p to both sites, but it seems that the YouTube live stream has a better quality, probably due to the codecs, the advances of YouTube, etc. But what I will say is you'll be able to interact with the chat if you have any additional questions. I didn't get any questions last week, which I found surprising because I did cover a lot of the automation side of it. Gave you some demos, and then I tied it into categories. Again, categories in automation, right, are key, and we're going to get into more automation later using a solution we call playbooks. But I don't want to take this off track. I want to focus on unified storage. So let me just hide this here, and we'll go to the demo. So again, this is the same environment I've been in the last 4 weeks that we've built together, right? So we basically stood up Community Edition, right? We deployed VMs, we added networking, the storage was already pre-configured as I showed you from the storage container perspective for consumption. And then we started enabling other features, right, within the platform, things like DR and, protection policies. And then things like network security. And now we're going to do the same thing with unified storage. Again, we're a software-defined solution, so our capabilities are applications, right? And so how we enable some of these things, right, is you go to the marketplace. So you can see here I have logged into Prism Central, and I went to the Admin Center drop-down, and then I went to the marketplace, and this brings me to the marketplace. The Nutanix Marketplace, and I showed you how to enable this before, will actually bring foundational or additional feature sets for Nutanix as well. So what I did was, under the Nutanix Unified Storage umbrella, you have 3 core capabilities. One is called volumes, and we're going to talk about that first because it's the foundational aspect of all the things that we're doing here. The next is files, and the next is objects, okay? So what I did here is I came in here and I actually clicked the Get button, and I installed the Files application, all right, on Prism Central, and then I installed the Objects application on Prism Central, okay? Now, this is a little bit different. So Objects, all you need to do is basically to enable object services is to install this Marketplace blueprint. For the file side, you have a Prism Element side as well, right? So you have the Files Manager, which is running on Prism Central, and you have the filer, which runs on Prism Element, right, which you deploy on the actual cluster itself. So if we do this one at a time, what you're going to start out is you're going to deploy Files Manager, and you're going to deploy Objects Manager. So get those 2 done, and if you go into My Apps, you'll see that I have both Objects and Files already deployed. Okay? The next thing you're going to do is make sure you have the right version. So the latest version is 5.1. If you go into LCM, right, and enforce an inventory, what'll happen is you'll have some updates, and you'll actually be able to update to 5.1 for both Files Manager, okay, and Objects Manager and Object Service. Okay, these 2 right here. Okay, so we want to get to the latest because it has some great benefits in the latest versions. And you should be able to do this on Community Edition because LCM works, and you'll be able to do that. Then the next thing you're going to do is you're actually going to go into your Prism Element cluster, and you can do that in a couple ways, right? So you can go to Infrastructure, and you can go to Hardware, you can go to Clusters, and in my case, I deployed files on my AI cluster, Cloud Native AI cluster, and there's a reason why I did that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you can click into this cluster, and you can launch Prism Element, and this will take you through, single sign-on, right, into Prism Element, where you have to run LCM again, because what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you have the appropriate filer version 5.1 that matches the Prism Central Files Manager version 5.1. Okay, so if you run an inventory and you perform an inventory right, you're going to see an update for FSM 5.10. Okay, so make sure you go through that upgrade. So again, order of operations is you're going to go into Admin Center, Marketplace, you're going to select Files. These apps, Nutanix apps, will already be here if you enable the Marketplace. Okay, so you're going to hit Get on Files, you're going to hit Get on Objects, and you're going to deploy those. And by the way, these are blueprints that are very similar to self-service blueprints, right? that's how we're deploying the application. We're actually using the self-service component to actually deploy these pre-canned blueprints that we provide in the marketplace, okay, for our software as well. All right. When that's done, you're going to go in here, do an LCM, do an inventory, make sure file server PC is up to 5.1, objects manager is up to 5.1, and object service is 5.1. Okay. Then you're going to go into Prism Element, you're going to perform an inventory, and you're going to make sure that FSM is 5.1 as well. Okay. Now, when you're done with that, you're going to go back to Prism Central, and you're going to deploy Filer first. So, you know, you can actually do these both at the same time, and I do them both in you know, not exactly at the same time, but I kick off the files deployment and I kick off the objects deployment. Let's do this one at a time so I can walk you through it. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go into Files. After that deploys, by the way, when you click down Admin Center, you're going to see more options under Unified Storage for files and objects. So you're going to click Files first. And you can see I've already deployed my filer, but let's walk through what this looks like. I'm going to create a new file server. I'm going to choose, and remember I talked about being able to run on AWS or Nutanix. I'm not going to get into the AWS piece. We're just going to run on Nutanix. So we're going to hit Nutanix. We're going to select a cluster. In my case, I selected USE CNAI. And you can see here I have 5.1 as the file server version. You wouldn't have this if you didn't go to Prism Element and do the inventory and upgrade to 5.1. That's why it's important you do that, because you want to match the files manager in Prism Central with the filer that you're going to deploy in the Prism Element cluster. Okay, you're going to select 5.1. You're going to hit proceed, and you're going to name it. You're going to put in your domain, and you're going to put in your file server logical size. So I always start with 1 TB. It depends on how much storage you have, but I think the minimum, I believe, is 1 TB. So again, you have to be able to create a logical size of 1 TB. So let's just do 1. And then I've already selected the cluster, so it's already grayed out. And then I can change my filer size based on my requirements. Now you can scale up later. So what I do is I believe I started at 6 and 16. But you can start at 4 and 12. You're just going to do basic file sharing. You're only going to use this to test. But in the guide, right, you'll be able to walk through the documentation. You'll be able to understand why these are important, because this provides, throughput, capabilities, etc., right, as you scale up, right, the actual file service VM. Another thing I want to point out is very important, because this is unlike production. Well, it could be like production, because you can deploy a filer on a single node cluster for Nutanix, but I'm in a lab environment, okay? So I can only deploy a single file server VM at a time, okay? Because I have 1 node. If I had 3 nodes or more, I could deploy multiple file server VMs in a distributed cluster, and that's typically what you would do in production, okay, for 90% of the use cases. For edge use cases like robo edge environments where you have 1 node possibly, and you want to have basic file server capability, you can do exactly what I'm doing here, which is deploying a file service VM on 1 node. But in production, right, you'll be able to deploy this in basically 2 fashions. Multiple file service VMs across the cluster to give you that distributed filer capability. And remember, Nutanix at its core is a distributed platform, right? And that's what we build everything on, okay? So you'll deploy filer in multiple filers in a files cluster, okay? And then you'll, depending on, in production, of course, we will guide you, because we have a sizing utility that actually, based on your information you provide us, we can guide you with the actual right sizing of your file service VMs, okay? And the hardware it sits on, right? Whether it's a hybrid solution or an all-flash NVMe solution, right, as an example. Then you're going to hit Next to deploy, and it's going to ask you for 2 networks. You have to have IP ranges within 2 networks, right? You have the access network, which is we call the client network, right, which accesses the file shares, whether it's NFS or SMB or both. And you have the storage network. Now, the storage network is important. I'm going to just X out of here really. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm already in here. The storage network is important. When you build the cluster, okay, you're going to go into cluster and you're going to create 2 IP addresses. All right, you're going to create a cluster VIP. So my CVM that runs on this cluster, right? That runs this cluster is 10.0.60.111. Okay. If I had more nodes, if I had 3 or more nodes, I would want a VIP, right? And so I define the VIP, and I define the VIP under virtual IP 10.0.60.110. So where you do this is you go up here in your Prism element cluster, and you just click on the cluster name, and you can see the cluster details where you can add these in. So I've already added the VIP in. The second most important, for a lot of different reasons, including files and objects, okay, is to provide what's called a data services IP. This IP needs to be in the same range as your cluster CVM IP and your VIP. Okay, so you can see here I have 10.0.60.115. Data services IP is extremely important because this is what's used to present block storage back to all these service capabilities I'm talking about. Okay, whether it's files, whether it's objects, whether it's PVCs, right, for Kubernetes, right, using CSI, all of these things are accessing the data services IP. So you have to have this defined or else this does not work. Okay. Now, do that first, by the way. I'm sorry, I should cover that first. So what you're going to do is you're going to create the client network. So I have server IPAM as the client network. You can map these out if you want manually, as long as you have a client-side network. And then you have a back-end network. That back-end network is the same network as the data services IP. Okay, so that's my native network. It's the 10.0.60.0/24. That network, right, is my CVM network where all the AOS traffic, all the storage traffic is consumed. Okay, I hit the IPAM here, and I hit next, and I define my DNS and my NTP servers. I hit next, it gives me a summary, and then I hit create. Okay, so what this does is it goes through a deployment of the filer. Okay, so you can see here I already have a filer already set up, right, and already deployed. Now, I want to talk about another thing. Remember I talked about the data service IP and being able to present block storage, right? We call volumes, right, back to either VMs or external devices or even our services like the filer. So the filer has to have storage, right? I can't just give you a filer with front-ending SMB or NFS without back-end storage capability, right? So where does that back-end storage capability come from? Well, it comes from volumes, okay? And so if you go in here and you go to infrastructure and you go under storage, you have volume groups, okay? And you can see a ton of volumes that have already been created, okay? So volumes are basically block storage, right? That's presented through the data services IP, right? To either external devices, right? You may have an physical Oracle implementation or server that you want to have access to block storage. You can access that, right, through iSCSI into our volume groups, right? But also our services like files and objects, right, need access to this. And by the way, we do this automatically, so you don't have to define any IQNs for iSCSI or anything like that. We take care of all that for you. And so you can see here that I have a filer called CNI. Remember, I went to the files when I deployed it. It's called CNAIF, so basically Cloud Native AI files. That's really what it's for. So CNAIF is the name. The FQDN is CNAIF.utech.local, which is my internal domain. Okay, and that's defined later. So I know I'm going around a little bit, but let's assume that your filer is deploying right now and you're waiting. Okay, so I want to walk you through what's happening. So when the file server VM is stood up and deployed, it's actually mapping on the back end to volume groups. So these volume groups are automatically created. Okay, you can see here NTNX CNIF in this UUID, and this NTNX CNF up here in this UUID. Okay, and what's happening is if you go into the volume, right, it's presenting this volume group back to the filer. And that's the block storage that the filer will use for its underlining storage. All right. And then the filer will then present, right, that storage in a files protocol, right, whether it's SMB or NFS. Okay, that's how Nutanix Filer works, right? We're backing our volumes, right, our block storage, AOS, our hyperconverged storage, to the filer, and then presenting that in a files protocol, right, which is SMB or NFS. Okay, and if you look here, you can look at the virtual disks. And what we're doing is we're carving out virtual disks, right, and striping them and bringing them in to the filer and giving you this capability, right, of being able to deploy very fast block storage for files to use, right? Objects is a little bit different, and we're not going to talk about objects yet. I want to get through filer. So now that you understand kind of how the back end works and how we're getting storage to our file services VM, right? The VM is now deployed. So let's assume that the VM is deployed. You're going to come in here and you're going to go into Files, and you're going to click into the filer. So this takes you into the dashboard, okay, the files management plane, where you can see a whole bunch of things, right? You have the dashboard that gives you a capacity summary. Over to the right-hand side, you see the health, okay? You see performance summary over time. Okay, in the last 24 hours, you can see that. What features are enabled, okay, on the filer. There are some that are not enabled, not configured, and enabled. And we'll talk about some of these things here in a little bit. And then what are the shares that are being used, okay? And you can see here I have two shares. One is called the PVC. Okay, this is when we get into use case. And one is called test. And that's just a basic SMB share, okay? Over to the right-hand side, you see that there's files analytics. This is what I was talking about for the governance perspective. We also provide you on-prem, a basic capability around files analytics. It's not really that basic though. It's pretty powerful, and we're going to show you what that looks like. But there is a SaaS solution which we'd want you guys to use called Data Lens, which is much more powerful than files analytics. Okay, and again, I'm not going to have time to get into that today. I'm really going to focus on files analytics and the governance around that, and then any recommendations that we're providing you. And what the recommendations actually provide you is basically a couple things. Is the filer performant, or does it need to scale up or scale out? And meaning, do I need to add more compute to the file service VMs to meet a specific requirement, maybe around throughput, right, or I/O, etc. Or is my data? Does my data need to be redistributed, right? And what I mean by that is, again, if you have multiple file servers and you have multiple vDisks and all these things, you know, how is my data being used? Do I have, and by the way, you actually have, in the SMB model, you have basically, you have two different types of shares. You have distributed shares and you have static shares, right? So the distributed shares allow you to distribute your shares across multiple file server VMs, right? And of course, your static share is basically, okay, this share belongs to one file server VM, okay? And it's non-distributed. So when you walk through that process, you know, over time as you use the filer and you grow into it and you add data and you're adding file service VMs and all this stuff, we want to make sure that data is distributed across the back-end disks, right, to give you that great performance. We don't want to have one vDisk out of the volume group servicing all your files capability, right? We want that data spread across the vDisk to take advantage of the distributed nature of how we're providing this. And so you may have a recommendation that says redistribute your data, or you may have a recommendation that says you should scale up, and here's a recommendation of scaling up your file server VMs, or here's a recommendation of scaling out where you need to add an additional file service VM, right, in your cluster as an example. And we'll manage that for you. We'll watch that and make sure you're meeting your performance, right? And that's the beauty of Nutanix, you know, giving you, you know, having this, you know, not autonomous, fully autonomous, but having this machine learning, right, and all these things running in the background that are looking at those things. So you're not having to kind of look at those things all the time, right? Again, it's about simplifying and really making undifferentiated value, right? Simplifying undifferentiated value. I had a LinkedIn post about that yesterday. It's important to simplify that and to kind of have you focus on more differentiated value things. Okay. Now you see a whole bunch of other things here. You have monitoring capabilities, so you can monitor the usage, right? The top shares, my storage use, my open connections, right? Number of files, performance, right? What's my latency, my throughput, my IOPS. And then if you, again, we do support ICAP and those things. I don't have ICAP enabled on here, so you're not going to be able to see anything. Looking at the file server VMs themselves, I only have one, right? Because I'm running on one node, and I'm not running an additional file server cluster, right? But if I had multiple nodes, I would see, I'd be able to see multiple file server VMs down here and getting access. Different colors for different file server VMs, right? Tiering, which we'll talk about. Basically, this allows you to tier your data into, so for example, if you want to archive data or tier colder data into objects, and it could be Nutanix objects, it could be AWS as an example, you could do that. We support tiering as well. And then smart DR replication. So smart DR replication allows this file share level replication from file server cluster to file server cluster. And I don't have two file server clusters stood up right now to show you that. Quite frankly, I just didn't have the time to do that within this week. I was so busy this week. But the reality is you can set up another filer, right, at a DR site, and you could have active, right? But then you could start doing smart DR when it comes to file share DR capability. And then, of course, you have your shares and exports, and this is where you would create shares, okay? Or you would see shares that are dynamically provisioned, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. This PVC share here is actually storage for a Kubernetes application that I'm running that's dynamically provisioned through our container storage interface for files, okay? And it automatically dynamically creates the NFS share for that application based on the secret you create to access, right? To access filer, as well as the storage class you create for files. And I won't get too deep into that because we're going to cover that in the Kubernetes section, which is going to be next week, okay? But here's where you create a share, right? So you could call this whatever, UK description, UK, department share. And you can put a path, right, if you want. And you can limit the size, right? So maybe I only want this 200 gig, and I want this to be SMB, right? And I hit next. And now I'm able to select specific things. So do you want the ability for self-service restore? So SMB shares typically that are accessible by users, right? Like home directories, those things, you want them to have self-service restore, right? Because what that's doing is we're basically using the snapshot capability with VSS, right? To allow for that restoration or enabling of self-service restore. And I'm going to show you a demo of that here in a little bit. You can have filer compress the data. You can block file types. So if I want to hit block file types, file types like MP3s or those things, or pictures, you don't want your users being able to store that on corporate provided or IT provided file shares. You can certainly block things like that, and you can enable worm. All right, so you can have write once, read many capability when it comes to file shares as well. So I'll just enable compression. We'll hit next, and then you can. There's SMB. Since this is an SMB share, I have SMB capabilities. Like what capabilities can I support? Well, you can support access-based enumeration. You can allow for long names. Now, what I will tell you is you have to make sure that you look at these question marks, because if you enable long names, like things like multi-protocol access won't work. So if you want to have NFS and NFS capability and SMB3 on a share, multi-protocol access, if you allow long names, that won't work. Okay, so make sure you're looking and making sure what things, if you enable, would not work. So the encryption of SMB3, right? When you enable encryption, you're going to enable CPU usage, right, and reduce throughput. Anytime you enable like encryption, right, there's an overhead to that. It's got to be paid for somewhere. So where is it paid for? Well, when I mean paid for, it's got to be paid for by compute, right, by resources. So where is it? It's paid for by the filer. right? Because this is done at the filer level, right? So the filer CPU usage will increase, and you'll have reduction in SMB throughput. But this SMB3 message encryption, right, may be important or a requirement to you, right? So that requirement may dictate you enable this, and as long as the file servers, right, are scaled properly to meet your performance requirement as well. And we see this all the time, right? That people require this. Now this is not data at rest encryption, right? This is SMB3 encryption. You still can have data at rest encryption on the back end, which the CVMs will take care of, right? That's a CVM overhead for that encryption to be enabled. And then, of course, you have your permissions, right? Your share permissions. So we'll hit next. We have a summary here, and then you can hit create, and it'll create the share. So I'm not going to create the share. I've already created a share called test. Okay, you can see this share. And now I can get different information at a share level. What does the mount path look like, right? So in my case, it's CNIF test, etc., right? What does that look like? And how do I access that? It's 100 gig max size, and I have compression enabled. Right now I'm getting a compression ratio of 2.44 to 1. Probably because I have a lot of pre-compressed data in there. You would get better compression depending on what the data is. Everybody's like, I can give you 10 to 1 compression. Like, you can? What's the data type? If the data is all pre-compressed, you're not going to get 10 to 1. Okay, so let's be honest, right? And I think that's sorely missing out there, right? Because I can't tell you how many times I see, we've gone up against competitor. I'll give you 40 to 1 data reduction. Well, they're counting snapshots and all this other stuff, right? I mean, let's be completely honest with our customers, right? And the reality is your data compressible? If it's compressible, we're going to compress. It's going to be a good compression, okay? If it's not compressible, it's not going to be a good compression outcome, right? And I think that's more in line with how we view data reduction. And of course, again, I have very small share. I don't have a lot of data in this share, but to get 2.44 to 1 is actually pretty good for what I have in here. Worm is disabled, access-based enumerations enabled, and I'm using the default share permissions, which you would never do. I'm also using, I also have share level protection, self-service restore enabled. I don't have share level protection enabled because I don't have another filer to replicate that data to. And I don't have ICAP or smart tiering stood up. But I do have self-service restore. So if I go into my map directory here, you can see it here. All right. And you can see here I have a map drive. I'm going to make this bigger so you guys can see it. Oh, I don't know what I did here. There we go. And I go to properties. I have previous versions. Okay. So by default, my share is there's a snapshot being done every hour on the share. So I can go back, every hour and restore from that snapshot. Okay? So if I accidentally delete a file or something, I can recover that data from a previous version. All right? And that gives me the power. And you can have your users be able to do this, right? Some users you may not want to have them do this, so you do it, but you can have your users, right, allowed to do this as well. So you're not getting tickets. Oh, I deleted a file, right? How do I recover it, right? So you don't have to do that, right? The user can do it. All right, let's get out of here. Here are the snapshots, right? I was talking about and again, you can see them in the previous versions on the share properties, or and we can monitor them here. There are quota policies that you can set up. Okay, you can do individual or user group quota policies. You can do hard and soft limits. So a hard limit would put the user in read-only mode if it reached the limit. A soft limit will not put the user in read-only mode and allow them to continue on, but alert emails will be sent, right? So, maybe on the share, maybe it's a home directory for me, and I send the email to the administrator as an example, and I send them to the user. Hey, you're reaching a limit on your quota. So either clean up your storage or put in a request to to expand the file share, make it larger if you have a legitimate request, right? Again, this is around not being wasteful, as well as governance over your environment. When I was in IT before I worked for partners and came to Nutanix, it's been a long time. I worked at Xerox, and I was a data center manager at the time, and I was responsible for all of the storage capability when it came to block storage, file storage, etc. And we would see this all the time where people would hit their limits and quota all the time. And what we'd find is most of the time they were putting non-work related stuff in their home directories, right? Pictures and all these things. And so, again, I'm not trying to be a Grinch, right? We want to make sure the work experience and the user experience is good, but we also want to be cognizant of what we're doing, especially today, because what I'm seeing today is there is hybrid solutions being delivered out there. I mean, still hard disks still have a use, right, when it comes to archive or cheap and deep storage for specific use cases, but most of the time we're seeing NVMe being positioned for most storage requests. And that's still expensive, it's not cheap. And so we want to make sure we're being thoughtful in how we're using things. Okay, so I know I'm probably going to go long again today. It's already 11:40. So again, usage, right, performance, tiering, antivirus, right? You can see all these things. So another thing too is, now that you have your files, let me go back into Filer again. So one of the things I want to talk about is the configuration. So after the Filer is done being stood up, the very next thing you should do before you're creating a share or anything is to make sure that, right, the authentication is there, right? If you're using SMB3, to make sure that you're joined to your domain, right? And your NFS is configured, whether you're using domain authentication or you're using it unmanaged, right, like I am. And what protocols do you enable for NFS as an example, right? You want to do that. And you also want to make sure your DNS entries are done. So you can go in here and update your DNS entries, and you can say add or update entries. You can pick the DNS server, your preferred name server, and use your account that gives you access to add DNS entries into that name server, right? Make sure that's done so DNS is working and Active Directory is working, right? Before you do anything. Because if you're going to use SMB3, which I'm sure you're going to use, or even NFS, all right, with directory, just make sure all these things are done, okay, before you do anything. Okay, so a couple more things I want to talk about. We talked about block file types where you can do it at a file server level or share level. The manage roles is important. Okay, so when I deploy the filer with my user account, my domain admin account, it asked me during the deployment, do you want to use this as a file server admin? And I said yes, so it automatically adds me as a file server admin, okay? Full file server admin access, full access. There are also REST API users, okay? You'll see here one called CSI and one called Analytics Admin. When I get into the Files Analytics piece of this in a second, this is automatically created, okay? This Analytics Admin, because what happens is the Files Analytics server communicates with the filer via API, via REST API, and so we need a user for that. There's also a CSI user that I've created. This is our container storage interface user. So for any Kubernetes solution, right, that I want to enable files, because you basically have two types of, you have three types of storage, right? You have, let's just talk about two for now. You have CSI for block, and you have CSI for files. For block, it's read write once. For files, it's read write many. Most of the time, I'm positioning files read write many because customers sometimes don't know what they need, and so filer is just a natural progression to use. But you can also use block if you know exactly you don't need read write many access to your PVCs. You can use block, which is native, right? So which is native within the CSI, but also within our CSI is files. Okay, so I need to have a CSI user created for REST API access for a filer. All right, to provision the shares. As a matter of fact, the share is automatically and dynamically provisioned. I don't manually create this NFS share for PVCs. It was actually provisioned during a deployment of an application. I'm going to show you that in a minute after I get through Files Analytics. Okay, so let's go back to Files Analytics. This is a little bit different in how you're going to deploy this. So over to the right hand side, you see Files Analytics. You would see enable here instead of enabled, right? But it would be in red because there is no Files Analytics server. So what you have to do is go back to your Prism element, okay? And you have to go under File Server, and you actually have to manage Files Analytics. This will be deploy. It won't be manage, it'll be deploy. And you're actually going to deploy the Files Analytics server, and it'll go through a walkthrough of doing that deployment. When that deployment's done, you're going to, and what it does is basically deploys a VM. So if I go back here, under infrastructure, under VMs, you can see here, you can see I have a lot of stuff now, right? We started very, very small. I have a Files Analytics right here, right? So NTNX FA CNAIF-A, that is the VM that's created to run the analytics side of it. So when that VM gets deployed and it's done, you're going to come back under Prism Central. So you're going to deploy it within Prism Element. All right, this will be deploy, not manage when you first deploy it. Then when it's done, you're going to come back to Prism Central, go into Files, live demo, go into Files, and go into Files Analytics, and you're going to enable Files Analytics. Okay, what this is doing is it's basically saying, okay, allowing Files Analytics to actually analyze the filer, right, and do the governance over the filer. So that'll become enabled, and then you'll be able to launch Files Analytics. And you're going to use your Prism element credentials to log in. Okay, so I have a domain account that's assigned. I've showed you how to do this before. And so I'm going to log into Files Analytics now. Okay, so I have a lot of things set up here, and I'm just going to go over some of these things. But basically, this is your governance, on-prem governance, right, of your file solution. And you can set up a bunch of things, right? You can set up audit trails. You can set up anomalies, which I have anomaly detection. You see I have anomalies here because I already set up some rules for that. Ransomware. Okay. You can see here that I had one ransomware event where it blocked a known ransomware signature. So what I did was .ecc is a known ransomware file extension, and I created a dummy file with .ecc, and I tried to bring it into Filer, and it blocked it, and then it reported on it. Okay, and it told me when this happened and from what client this happened from. Okay, so again, gives you very, very granular access, and we support out of the box in Files Analytics 249 signatures. Now, if you know of additional signatures, what you can do is, or file extension types, you can manually add them into your block file type. Okay, Data Lens is a little bit better when it comes to this. So, Data Lens, obviously has some expansive capability when it comes to this because it's a SaaS solution. And again, I'm not going to get into Data Lens. We'll probably do that in a later session. But Data Lens will give you much broader governance, right, and allow you to actually go through what we call, a detect, respond, and recover capability, meaning Data Lens detecting it, responding automatically, like locking the file, right, locking access to the file, and then being able to recover through a snapshot or a replica, through a snap, right? So being able to detect, respond, and recover is extremely important, and Data Lens offers that capability, all right? And then you can also do reports, right? So if you want to do a files report or a user report on a username, I can say, okay, I'm Sheehy, which is my username, and I can run a preview and see what this report looks like. Okay, or I can do pre-can report, top active users. What's that look like? So I'm the only user, right? So of course it's going to be me, and I can generate a report in a CSV or JSON file. So if you want to get reports, you can do that as well. But just to go back to dashboard real quick, we're monitoring your capacity trends, any permission denial. So if I try to get access to a file, and by the way, if you continue to see access, excuse me, on files that have permission that don't have permission. That could be a sign of something, right? It could be malware or something like that that's trying to access the file, right? Ransomware, etc. File distribution size, right? What's greater than 1 meg? What files are 1 to 10, right? So we do that, number of files. Top active users, right? Top access files, right? In this case, we have a thumbs.db file that's been accessed 3 times in 24. I know this is very small. What operations are happening on the file? Or, what's the distribution of those operations, right? From create, write, delete, read, etc. What's the distribution type of the file, right? How many are audio files, video files, images, others? What's hot, warm, and cold, right? So this was just stood up. I want to say this. It was last night, I believe I did this. Last night I stood this up, so you're not going to get like really compelling data around data age because it's only been a day since this has been up, not even a day. And then you have anomaly alerts, right? You see that there are multiple users deleted one document, and I created an anomaly rule. Okay, so you can see here I have a delete of 5% on 5 operations for all users daily. And I did that very small to actually trigger those alerts. And I went in, I deleted 6 files. Okay, when I did that, it hit the anomaly, right? And then it reported on the anomaly. So you can see here that multiple users deleted 1 document, right, at this time, or deleted 6 documents, or created 12 documents, right? So we're making sure that based on the anomaly rules that you have configured, we're monitoring for those things and reporting on it. And anomalies could be, again, malware. It could be people, right? You could have a disgruntled employee who got fired or knew they were going to quit and went in and tried to delete a whole bunch of things, right? And then left, right? And that happens, unfortunately, right? It just it just happens every once in a while. And so we want to make sure we're protecting ourselves and getting audit data on those things. Okay. I did talk about ransomware already. And so this is, basic files analytics, which you have available to you when you purchase files, or during your lab. If you want to see this in action, you can actually leverage this and deploy it, right? So everything I'm showing you up to this point, you can deploy these things. Some will have, like I said, some will be eval, right? And some will not be eval capability, right? Next week, we're going to start the section on some of these services that are not part of Community Edition, or you can't get access without being a customer, okay? And that's around Kubernetes. And there's discussions, I will tell you up front, we're having discussions on that if we allow a home lab version or a community version of NKP, our Kubernetes platform. We'll talk about that later. But the reality is we probably should be doing that and giving you guys access to actually see what it looks like and being able to use it. Okay, so this is Files Analytics. This is Filer. I talked a little bit about this. Again, I'm already in 50 minutes on the stream today. I want to get into objects. Okay, but before we do, I did talk about one of the use cases, right? So one of the use cases we talked about were read-write-many NFS mounts for Kubernetes. This happens to be and I'll just go here and I'll show you. There is a Nextcloud application you can see here. You might not be able to see this. I'll make this bigger. And you can see the application here, right? It's basically multi-service Nextcloud, right? It has a database backend and a web front end. It has PVC requirements around block storage and read-write-many. So for file storage for Nextcloud, I actually have 2 PVCs created. This files PVC, right? That's the PVC that dynamically gets created when I deploy. All right. So because I predefined a secret that is assigned to that REST API user CSI within files, I created a secret in Kubernetes. Then I created a storage class, right, for files within my Kubernetes cluster. Now I'm able to basically dynamically provision PVCs at will for files, which is awesome because now I don't have to go in and say, hey, can you create a NFS share for these PVCs, a static share for these PVCs, and then I have to mount it and do all these things. I can just dynamically provision everything and not have to worry about going in and waiting on requests, right? Again, simplifying it, right? Being agile, being quick in delivery of capability and services. That's what I'm talking about, right? And this is a real application, right? So let's see what this looks like. So actually, let me see what the ingress is for this. I don't know what the ingress is. Yep, so if I go to nextcloud.utech.local, this should work, all right? And there it is, okay? So I've deployed a multi-tier application with a web front end, database backend. I haven't configured this yet, but it's using persistent storage from block through CSI, as well as file storage for read-write many access. It's dynamically provisioned automatically, okay? And you also enable snapshots. You can actually enable snapshots on this as well if you want to have protection capability, right? To be able to actually snapshot your PVCs, right? Whether it's files or block. In this case, we're talking about files. You can actually do that as well. And we'll talk about more demos on that and more around how we protect persistent data in Kubernetes next week, okay? But just to give you an example of a use case for files. Other use cases besides shares, right? There's a ton of use cases, right? Use cases around image data. I mean, you could use objects for that too. Another thing too is you're blurring the lines too of where you should do files and objects. And we're going to get into objects in a minute, but there are some blurs there, right? I mean, you could use this for, you could use a file share for backup storage, and then you can tier that off to objects, your older backups, because Worm is supported, so you may want to do that. Or you can send it right to objects. In my case, I send it right to objects, okay? You know, everything from, you know, core storage capability for applications when it comes to PVCs for Kubernetes as an example, all the way to NVR storage for your NVR data, right? So you could create a hybrid cluster, right, that stores your network video recorder storage for your security environments. We have a lot of customers using it for that, right? Customers using it for departmental shares and home directories. Customers using it for, like I said, NFS application persistent storage for Kubernetes as an example. You know, sky's the limit, right? When it comes to Filer. And the beauty about this is it's completely distributed and scalable, right? So distributed storage, scalable, scale up and scale out, right? Giving you massive performance. One of the other bigger use cases is AI, right? And being able to deliver very robust performance for AI. Matter of fact, we've done some tests with ML performance testing, and we're saturating massive amount of GPUs, right, using Filer. Now, of course, these are all NVMe solutions, bigger clusters, 200 gig networking, etc., right, to accommodate for that, but we're getting massive throughput, and we're on the top. Nutanix is at the top when it comes to performance, especially around AI capability. That's massive throughput, right? You're feeding mass amount of GPU data, right? And it needs that throughput. So anything from the top tier high performance use cases like that use case all the way to the lower performant, more sequential write and read performant data in hybrid solutions for like NVR capability or your basic file share capability, right? All that supported. And this is, by the way, the second most popular solution at Nutanix. It's been around for a long time. We continue to innovate. And as a matter of fact, there's other innovations coming around data classification when it comes to data lens and doing things like that, because customers want to classify data, putting the data in the right location, right tier, making sure data is AI ready. I don't think we talk enough about that. We talk about AI and models and tokens and output and all these other things, right? And prompt engineering, but there's little talk about data, and that's extremely important. If your data is not AI ready, it comes back to garbage in, garbage out, right? Very, very simple. Okay, let's get into, I'm going to close Files Analytics, and I'm going to go back to Prism Central, and I'm going to go to Objects. Okay, so you can see here I have Objects. Now, you don't have to go to, unlike Files, you don't have to go to, when you selected Objects in the marketplace and deployed it, you're going to get right to this under Objects, okay? You don't have to go into Prism Element and deploy or update any object service on Prism Element through LCM. Okay, you're ready to go. Okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to create an object stores access keys. You can federate namespaces. So if I have multiple object stores, right, across multiple Prism Central instances, geo-dispersed, you can have a federated namespace. And by the way, you can actually have a unified namespace on files too. I didn't talk about that. But you can also have a federated namespace on objects. Okay? An object store, you see here, I created an object storage called CNS3. So let's see what this workflow looks like. We, again, both support HV and ESX, by the way. In my view, we're going to be supporting HV, and it tells you exactly what you need to deploy this. This is different. We're not deploying, we are deploying VMs, but we're underneath the hood, we're deploying containers, right, for object services. And we're using persistent volumes from volume groups, provision to the containers, right, to be able to actually leverage the block storage on the back end and present S3 compatible objects. Okay? So we hit confirm, and now we're going to call this whatever, CNS3. You keep the domain native. I'm going to use management cluster. I only have one node, so I can only do one worker node. Okay? I can only do one. So I'm only one node. Remember, if I have more than one node, if I have 3 nodes or more, I can do distributed. And that's the power of the platform, right? Is this distributed nature of it. You can scale. Okay? And that's the beauty of it. But if you have a single node, like at a robo edge case, like I kind of demoing here, right? Because that's my environment, single nodes, then you can still deploy objects, right? That capability is there. You're just limited by the amount of worker nodes, right, to deliver on the object services. But if you have a high performant use case at the edge, you'd want to have three nodes or more to deliver that performance, right, of Nutanix. But if you have a small use case like backup or something like that, or some other objects use case for Kubernetes, maybe Cozy, or you're doing registry storage, which is some of the things that we're going to talk about in a minute. You can do that as well with one node. Depends on what your needs are, right? What your requirements are. So we're going to hit next. You need the storage network. This is a little bit backwards from the files. Your storage network, so native IPAM. We'll hit next. And then you'll have your public network, which is your client network accessing the objects, right? And I'll just use server IPAM, and we'll just use this right here. Then I'll hit save and continue, and it's going to go through a test. It's going to validate that all the IPs are right, everything that you need is correct, right? And it's going to deploy not just the worker node, right? Worker nodes for the object services, but also the load balancer we call Envoy, right? And you'll see 2 VMs in my use case. You'll see, because I only have one worker node, you'll see 2 VMs created. You'll see a worker node VM created and an Envoy VM created, and that's your load balancer. Okay? Now, you can download this checklist, or when you do a save and continue, it'll go through the checklist for you to validate your configuration. It'll tell you what's wrong if something's wrong. All right? So I'm not going to go through that, but you're going to deploy that. And you can see here I've already deployed an object store called CNS3. Okay? When I click in that, I have a bunch of things, right? I have my summary, like how do I access CNS3? I can scale it out, right? If I have additional nodes, right? I can't because I only have one node, one Nutanix node. But if I had more than one node for Nutanix, I could scale out. Like if I had 3 nodes or more, I could scale out, right? This is where I create my buckets. The buckets, again, can be statically provisioned or dynamically provisioned through Cozy. So let's talk about static provision. You can see here I have a Haiku bucket. And as a matter of fact, let's go into Haiku because remember we did this last time. And this is, again, I want to just say this is not about Haiku because I don't want you to say, oh, here he goes talking about Haiku again. We already have our own backup solution. That's fine. You may have Rubrik or Cohesity. You may have all these other different things, but you may need a storage target, and objects is a great storage target for backups. Okay? And so what I did was, you remember the policy I created for Nutanix integration, right? When I did the policy integration, and I did those 3 VMs, right? When I scaled out my WordPress application, it fell under that. So what I did was I went and edited this integration, and I changed my backup target to CNS3. Okay? And when I did that, right, it didn't migrate the backups from my NAS to, right, it just continued on with the additional backups, right, and sent them to the Haiku target. So how did I do that? Well, I created a bucket called Haiku, right? I did that first. And when I created that bucket, I gave it different characteristics, right? I enabled worm, and I want to do that because it's a backup solution and it's backup storage. I don't want anything impacting my backups, right? I want to make sure that that my backups only have read one or write once, read many access. Okay, I want to protect my backups, okay, from ransomware, etc. And I disabled versioning, and I disabled multi-protocol access. You can actually enable NFS on S3 as well. Okay, so you can do multi-protocol access. I don't need that for this. You can monitor the performance of the backup, or excuse me, of the bucket. The user access. Okay, this is what's different. So what I did is I went in here under access keys. I created a user on the domain called, and by the way, this is all tied to my domain, right? My authentication is tied to my domain, all right? And I have a user called Haiku. You may call it backup, and it has specific rights on the bucket, and it gives me these keys. And I really shouldn't show you this key, but you don't have the secret key, so it doesn't really matter. It's useless to you. The reality is right, it gives me an access key and a secret key. You don't see the secret key here. I've already stored it. Okay. When you create an account, let's just do that. We'll create an account. Let's just do Mike MG. I hit next. I can apply tags if I want. I can generate a key, and then I can download the keys, and then I'll have my access key and my secret access key. And like with any solution, we don't show you your secret access key in the environment, right? That's something you have to document, right, and have. So you can download the keys. Let's cancel that. I'm going to delete this anyway. So delete this user, delete the user, delete. Okay? So I have a Haiku user, and then when I go into my bucket now, I'm going to now share my bucket, right? I'm going to make a share. So when I click on it, I hit share. I add the Haiku user for share. Now, you wouldn't give it full access. I just did this to make it quick. But you're going to want to do a custom set of access on the bucket, right? So in my case, it probably is going to be read-write objects and whatever subset of permissions I need to grant it. All right, but I did make it full access just to do the demo. And right now, Haiku is sending backups to this bucket in Nutanix objects, okay? And by the way, it's doing it automatically, right? Again, I'm just changing the target of where the backups were going to. I'm not changing the policy, and I'm not changing the categories. Remember, those categories are still tagged to those VMs. Those VMs are still being backed up. They're just being backed up to a different location under objects. Another use case is Cozy, right? So this is container object storage interface. And what I've done here is I'm kind of going to show you a little bit. It's going to be a little bit confusing, but I'm in NKP, which is our Kubernetes platform solution. And I'm going to go to global, clusters, commander host, which is our management. And you're going to see applications here. And what you'll see is this Cozy driver for Nutanix. This wasn't deployed automatically. I enabled this through our application stack. Okay? And this Cozy driver basically allows dynamic provisioning of the bucket within objects. And I've defined, right? I've defined under the configuration my object, my Prism Central, my username and password, my objects endpoint, which is what this is. Okay? My objects endpoint, which is this, right, over here to the right, this IP address. I've defined that in the Cozy provider within NKP. I've given it an objects access key and a secret key. And where do I get that from? The same place I showed you before under access keys. You see this NKP service account? Well, I'm using those access keys, right, where the Cozy driver within the Kubernetes platform, when I request something, it builds the bucket automatically dynamically for me, and it did. And the bucket I needed was for Harbor. And what is Harbor, right? Harbor is basically a image registry that you can run on-prem. And so when I go back here, under applications, I deployed Harbor, and under Harbor configuration, right, it deployed this bucket using the Cozy driver. Okay, or excuse me, the Cozy interface. So I said that twice. So using Cozy, right, the Container Object Storage Interface. All right, and you can see here when I go back here and I go to buckets, you'll see this objects store, this bucket being created. Okay, now I have nothing in it yet because I haven't pushed any images or anything like that to Harbor, but Harbor's configured now to use object storage. Okay, now again, another use case for objects. There are so many other use cases for objects, right? There is static website, right? Being able to run a static website and storing that website on S3. Images for websites, as an example. Like, why would you store, obviously you're not going to store the images within the application stack itself. You're going to want to call, an S3 endpoint to deliver those images into websites. Say you have a store front end, as an example, and you have pictures of your items in the store front end. You're going to store those images in objects, in S3 objects, and you're going to call those objects for your, as part of as part of your product deployment, right? Your product identity, right? So say you're selling shoes. Well, this pair of shoes, right? This image of these shoes or images of these shoes is located on S3 objects, but it's it's not located on, it's not statically on the website itself. It's stored in object services, as an example. Okay, so again, objects can be used for many different things. Okay, and here I showed you backup. Again, I showed you another Kubernetes use case, right, to use for image registry storage, and it can be used as a archival mechanism too. So remember I talked about files being able to tier. Well, I can go into files and set up a files tier in here, have it age out your cold data into an object storage, because generally speaking, objects is more reasonable in cost per gigabyte. Okay, and so people may want to use that for archive, right? Now, there's also tiering in objects itself. So if I go into this bucket, I can create a rule lifecycle, right? But before I do that, I actually have to set up a tier, okay? So I have to set up what's called a tiering endpoint. So when I go back to Object Store, I can create a tiering endpoint, okay? And that tiering endpoint can be, it's not in here, hang on. The tiering endpoint can be S3, or it could be another Nutanix objects, right? Could be a lower cost object store using a hybrid solution for archive, or it could be an S3 bucket, or it could be an Azure Blob location, etc. Now, Cloud Bucket endpoints. Yeah. Yeah. So I can pick these Cloud Bucket endpoints, right? Whether it's Nutanix, AWS, Azure, or other S3 compatible storage. Azure is a bit different, right? Azure is not S3 protocol, right? It uses its own proprietary protocol, but we get around that, right? There are ways that Azure presents itself through an S3 endpoint, even though it's using a blob, right? So again, the idea is creating a tiering endpoint, and then on the bucket, right, giving it a lifecycle policy, right? Saying, okay, create a rule. Tier objects. Sorry. And I don't have a tiering endpoint, but tiering objects after, to this endpoint after so many days, right, as an example. Or I can expire the actual objects as well after a certain amount of days, and what version it is. So if I had versioning enabled on the object, I can do that too. But from a tiering endpoint perspective, I can actually set this up and have it tier into AWS as well. Again, I know this was, we went long again today. There's a lot of information This is really about files and objects and how you can use these things and how, again, we're not stitching this capability in with our other solutions, right? We're using known interfaces like CSI for Kubernetes, Cozy for Kubernetes, right? S3 compatible endpoints, SMB and NFS protocols, dynamic provisioning, static provisioning, all different types of governance, right? So you get all this capability with Nutanix around unified storage as another added set of platform capabilities that encompass the entire platform, okay? Now, there are 3 more solutions I want to talk about which you generally will not have access to using Community Edition. All of what I showed you up to this point, you will have access using Community Edition, all right? So you have unstructured data services for files, objects, automation, basic VM management, security, all those things are available to you to use in Community Edition, all right? The 3 things I'm going to start talking about in the next coming weeks are that I'm going to start with Kubernetes around NKP. There isn't a Community Edition version of NKP yet, or Nutanix Kubernetes platform. We have Database as a Service, which we haven't really talked about. We need to get into. And there's Nutanix Enterprise AI capability, okay? Which, by the way, uses all of the things we talked about. Uses files, right? Uses NKP. Series, right, of the Nutanix Home Lab series onto services that unfortunately you can't leverage in your home lab, but I want you guys to see what it looks like. And then when we end on AI capabilities, you're going to see the power of using all of the services together, right, to deliver on AI inferencing as an example, and we'll set up actual real AI applications using real models, do model management and all those things. So, I'm excited to get into that stuff because, again, a lot of these things I'm showing you here are great and they provide you great capabilities. But there's a lot of value being added into cloud native technologies and AI right now, right? And I want to get into those things. So I hope you have a great rest of the day. And again, a very productive week ahead. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Again, I think episode 5 will be next Saturday is my hope. I may skip a week. I'm not sure yet. I may want to have a guest on next week and talk about some of the things that we went over and have a real live conversation with someone who's actually using this capability in production. And I think that's something I'll want to do at some point. It may not be next week, but I want to try to do that in the near future. So again, hope you have a great week ahead, a great rest of your day, and thanks for joining today. Have a great one. Bye-bye.